My guest today is Mandy Caphart, and Mandy happens to be a grief coach. And as many of you know, this month we started a new podcast called Grief Belief. Grief is a real emotion, it happens to all of us, and most of us wonder why we're not prepared. And I don't think there's any way to be prepared for grief. However, finding the right coach to get you through your sorrows is very important. Mandy, when I um, go on to podmatch.com, it surprises me how many of us um, are searching for the answer. You know,
Mm.
when is grief going to just disappear? When am I going to be happy? Or how can I be happy when I feel so terrible? So I'm hoping that you're going to be able to help us along that way because you talk about a 5 step model. And I know grief isn't one size fits all, but there are certain things that we don't all experience. So, welcome to Avoid the Maze.
Thank you, Karen. I'm honored to be here because talking about grief is one of the most complicated and unapproachable topics. And so I love making it really accessible and hopefully help people find some meaning in what they're experiencing for themselves.
Absolutely. So, give us a little bit of background. None of us start out our career by saying, I want to talk about loss, death, grief.
Yeah.
We usually think of things like, you know, I want to talk about the sun's coming up today and how
Yeah.
warm it's going to be.
Yeah.
So,
The
what
pos-
brought you here?
Yeah, sorry. The positive emotions are a lot easier, no question. And so when I lost my mom in 2016, she was one of many people. I've lost count, absolutely, of the number of people who have died in my life, or lost count of the times I've moved or changed schools or lost a relationship or any of the other, 50 some odd ambiguous grief experiences in life because it's not just connected to death.
Right.
But losing my mom in 2016 was a whirlwind. It was after years of infertility issues. We'd finally had our first child. And then after her birthday, after her first birthday, my mom was diagnosed with cancer. Um, it rapidly took her life, and that spent me down this new trail of trying to decide how I was going to move through my life differently now that I'd lost my mom, who to me had been an anchor. It was probably 2018, a couple years later, after years of really pouring into all of the grief resources and my faith community and my family, and realizing not only are none of them available to me, none of them are really showing up in a way that is meaningful or that is helpful. They're also floundering and have no idea what to do. There's got to be something different. And so I had started right before that to speak publicly and share my story with individuals as well who were going through a lot. And I've always been in positions of leadership, no matter which organization or job I've been in. So it was very natural for me to see people in pain and say, it's okay to be uncomfortable. It's actually really powerful to learn how to remain in discomfort for a period of time. And in 2020, when the pandemic hit, I had just suffered a miscarriage as well. And I lost my job because of the pandemic, and I decided if ever there was a time that I would move into writing a book and into a new career, this is it. This is my chance to really test it out, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But I can't live in a world that will be as grief illiterate as it is right now, especially after a global pandemic annihilates our ability to function properly, or not even properly, but as we're used to. So the acknowledgement of the uncomfortable nature of loss and life has been very, very pinnacle to why I decided, yeah, I can do this. I can have these awful conversations with people on a daily basis because they deserve someone who can show up for them when they need it the most.
You know, we share a commonality, one which I'm sure once I tell you, we're gonna say, "We wish that wasn't it," but I too lost my mother in 2016,
Wow.
and, the it doesn't make any difference how old we are, how young we are,
Right.
losing a parent, and especially a mother, and I've heard it from so many other people, um, there is it feels like a more devastating loss.
Mm,
And for me, I had never had the opportunity to grieve for my father who had died um, 12 years before her.
mm,
And
mm,
so all of a sudden I realized, wow, this is big.
yeah,
Um, but I was so busy taking care of things for everybody else in the family that I put my grief on hold.
yeah,
And it was during that time that I realized that you have to tell your story. Because if you don't, people around you aren't going to know why you're acting the way you are. And I
sure,
realized I was not acting like me, whatever that means.
sure,
I was almost like an out of body experience for a
yeah,
while. And so I know how important the subject of loss is. And want people to understand, like you just said, loss is not just about the death of a loved one.
yeah,
It can be um, either losing a job or not getting the job that you're applying for that you
mhm,
think is supposed to be yours.
yeah,
Um, Again, you mentioned another one, miscarriage. So many people um, look at you and they'll say, well, you have a beautiful child.
right,
And it's like, yes, I do, but I still have lost
yeah,
something, and it's more
yeah.
than we can see.
I think that people tend to want very quickly to be supportive and move us through our pain because it is uncomfortable and they're not necessarily equipped or capable of being in that discomfort with us. And so we think we are causing comfort and positive emotional help when really we are creating bigger chasms between us and other people. And so, one thing that's very common in all the work that I do with grievers is recognizing, okay, well, what do you do when it feels like no one understands you? It feels like you've had this other secondary loss of your sense of self. You're not sure who you are. You're not sure how to find your way, quote, back to yourself. What do you do when everything feels that just distant, just out of reach? And that conversation really comes back to remembering, well, everything we say, no matter what context we're in, moves us closer to or further from the people around us and the people that we are ourselves. And when you can recognize that what someone is trying to do is move closer toward you, you have a choice. You can give them access and say, hey, I hear that you wanna come closer to me in this. Your approach is all wrong. And here's why, and that's okay. You don't know what you don't know. But the problem I find most often with grievers when I say that, because they're fine, they're all happy about, like, let's invite people in, let's help them learn how to say what's helpful and what isn't, avoid what isn't helpful, is the idea that grievers are then supposed to know what is helpful for them when that's like the last thing on our mind. Often I'll say, don't give homework to grievers by saying, what do you need? Instead, recognize your person. If it's my sister and we both lost the same person, I can assume what she will need based on my context of what I know I need. But what is more meaningful for grievers to experience is to have someone who knows who they are and knows their values, knows what is important to them, and actually just asks permission. Hey, I know that eating healthy is really important to you right now. Can I provide groceries for your house for the month? Or can I bring a meal that is really nourishing? Instead of just arbitrarily saying, hey, I'm dropping dinner off, like, being intentional and leaning into the discomfort for grievers is this place where we get this new sense of community that we genuinely lose. Like you were saying, you show up and you don't know how to behave or no one knows how to relate because they're just confused and the truth is we all are. None of it makes sense. And so the more we engage that humble side that says, well, I don't know, but I'm willing to learn, then the more we will lean towards one another as we're navigating loss in as a community because it's never
Yep.
just an isolated person.
So, and I like how you described the fact that you and your sister both had a loss, in theory, the same loss, but the relationship may not have been exactly the same.
Completely different.
Um, and I found the same thing when my mother passed. I have two older brothers, and um, one brother, you could tell he was emotional and he was sad, but he was somewhat removed because he lived on the other side of the country, and um, he had just seen my mother and he saw her in good health, and that's all he wanted to remember.
Sure.
And then my other brother and I, we basically stayed with my mother for 2.5 months of the end of her life. And so we both needed something totally different. And I realized all three of us did.
Yeah.
And family tried to treat us as one,
Right.
and it wasn't working. And it took me a long time to understand that. And you basically have explained that. So, when you sat down and you wrote this guidebook, was it based on what you needed? Or was there a lot of research, interviewing people saying, hey, what did you go through? What did you need?
That's a great question because so the book is part memoir. I call it memoirish because it's a 31-day guidebook to embracing our losses without losing ourselves. And it's absolutely what I experienced combined with a lot of feedback, but also just research into the grieving industry and especially how the faith communities can play into that or make it harder. So, in my background, I've been a part of faith community since I was probably 17 um, or so. And after my mom died, she was one of many losses that we'd experienced in our church group as well, in this small community, including a very dear, like my husband's best friend. And so, what ended up happening prior when he passed away, I witnessed so many people treating his widow, who I consider a sibling, incredibly well for a minute, for a week, for a month, for 2 months, for a year. It would die off. It was very, like, percentage-wise, right? Okay, 2% of the people are still here after a month, 1% is here after a year. I'm the only one that's still consistently engaging and reaching out, and so, all of that to say, I was curious about how my own experience would go, knowing it wasn't my spouse, but it was still someone really beautifully important and integral to my life, and it was similar. There was a lot of, "We don't know what to do with you, so, we're just gonna avoid the conversation," which really upset me because I'm not an avoider, I'm a confronter. When there is something to be addressed or handled or even clarified or to find healing with, I really go after it. And so this book became my kind of pushback, but also my training for communities like mine, where they believe to a degree that healing isn't a destination, where it's healed and done. I've moved through, I've taken the steps, I've done the work, and now I'm healed and I move on. Whereas the truth is, healing is always ongoing. It is as integrative and important to integrate into our lives as breathing, because without it, we'll be living this half life, right? We know that holding our breath is detrimental to our bodies. And I kind of think of pretending we're not grieving anymore or coping to the point where we just push it aside really feels like living a half life. So the book is framed very simply. There are faith principles from a number of different practices throughout the whole thing. And it's really designed to be a snippet of take what you need and leave the rest behind. So it's all very short because grieving or reading is very difficult when you are grieving. And it is based on the 5 stages of grief only because they're familiar. They're not applicable to grievers who are alive by any means, but the 5 stages, denial, bargaining, anger, depression, and acceptance. And I swapped 2 of those, but um, they're useful insofar as they can help us with language of what we might be experiencing, but acceptance is not the end goal for us who live and survive a loss. for me, restoration is the end goal. And so that's where this book really goes to is how do you create restorative practices in your life that are ongoing, that are capable of being integrated into your daily practices, into your daily life, or that can act as my friend puts it, grief insurance that lives on your shelf. So when something swirls back in, and you realize I'm experiencing acute grief again for something I thought was moved into subtle grief and I was okay, or stable, or steady, or what, however you want to put it, then that book is available that you can jump in and be like, oh, this practice would really be helpful for me today, or I'm never going to do that one practice again. That was horrible. So it's chock full of resources. I just wanted it to be something that was available to anyone, especially when resources and grief support are so hard to access right now.
Absolutely. And you mentioned something that I've heard so many times, um, is, when are you going to be healed from your grief? When is your grief going to be over? Um, I worked with a young woman who lost her mother. I think it's about 10 years now. Um, and she was a young mother herself, like you.
Mm,
And almost daily, she was posting about how much she missed her mom. You know, today she was in the grocery store, she saw something, she was crying because that was something her mother would have bought and made for dinner. Little things like this. And people would write back to her and go, you know, you need to take a step back. You need to heal. And I remember writing to her, and this is before my mother passed away. I wrote back and I said, feel what you need to feel when you feel it,
mhm,
because nobody can tell you how to think, how to feel. And
right.
those feelings are important. Um, and she still to this day, every once in a while, she'll post something. Her oldest son is going to be a senior in high school. And she mentioned when she was taking his pictures on the first day of school, you know, I wish your grandmother could see you now.
Mm,
I wish I could have my mother by my side. And I applaud her
mhm,
because her mother is part of her and
mhm,
she's going to talk about those things. So, for those listening, just because somebody goes through those so called stages,
mm,
maybe early on, it doesn't mean that years later they're not going to go through those stages again.
right. Yeah. So we have these moments of acute grief where it's that I can't breathe deeply enough. I've just had this loss experience, or something has triggered me and I've gone into this experience as if it's really happening. And that's typical, and it lasts as long as it lasts, and you get support as much as you need through it without anybody shaming or shooting on you. And then at some point we start to notice that we are experiencing healing even in little tiny snippets, because the things that triggered us yesterday may be less triggering today. That's an indicator of healing. And it doesn't have to be something, you know, world changing or seemingly world changing, because our world has changed. It's little and it's noticeable. And I think that we fail to recognize that that is because grief is really a spiral. And as we grow as humans, we are expanding to include new things that we're learning, and we're bringing with us things that really served us well, and leaving behind the things that we realize are pulling us back or dragging us down. And so grief is the same way. When we spiral upward or downward, it's our choice really with how we engage it.
Mm.
Um, or support ourselves through it. But that spiral upward is this idea that, yes, I'm going to come back to a same place and experience similar emotions as I did then. But in theory, I will have integrated new things, and I will have expanded myself to realize, oh, I'm in a different position looking at my grief now. So I'm seeing it from a different perspective, with different tools, with different support for myself, and with a different understanding of who I am now on the other side of loss. And I think that that's really difficult to do. It's easy for me to like say, and there it is. That's how you do it. But I think that what I've experienced is how impossible that feels when you don't have an understanding of really what makes you you. And so I'm very clear with all of my clients that I approach grief and loss from the perspective that you are a whole person, mind, heart, body, and spirit. And so we look at loss from this perspective. And this goes back to when you said, feel your feelings, because I agree. I think we need to then know what do we do with those feelings, emotions, thoughts, or connectedness or disconnections once we've experienced them and we're ready to do something with them. And it really goes to taking action on our own behalf. So when you have a thought or an emotion or a feeling in your body or a sense of connection or disconnection, becoming really curious about that is where we can then say, oh, well, this is me noticing something about my loss that I maybe didn't know was there or didn't notice before. And it's that level of curiosity that allows us to feel our emotions and experience them and experience our thoughts without judgment. And that lack of judgment against ourselves, no matter how long it's been, leads us towards this, "Oh, well, if I'm not judging myself, then I'm naturally going to be more curious about why or what I could do differently." And it's really that mindset of curiosity that leads us away from feeling like we need to find healed as a destination and recognizing, "Oh my gosh, healing is every day. Healing is ongoing. There will be days that things seem much heavier, but when I get to those heavier moments, I have XYZ experience behind me and these people in place, and I've tried new things and let's see if it works today. It may not, but it's less uh not less, it's more present mindedness than we were yesterday. And that in and of itself is an indication that we're healing.
So, how did your community relate to you when you wrote the book and uh, started coaching? Because you say you live in a small community, um, you belong to a faith based group, and sometimes aspects of coaching and advice sometimes are frowned upon because it's like, hey, who do you think you are?
Totally. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. It was definitely a mixed bag. And I have 20 years of history with this community of people. So I was fortunate there in that every one of them that I interacted with knows and respects and loves and appreciates me. And so for me to come back and say, hey guys, this is actually something I think is really important. What do you think? Could this benefit who we are as a community? Could this benefit us as individuals? And I had an opportunity to test it out immediately because I was writing the book starting in about March of 2020. And in September, it was pretty much done. Um, and ready for editing, but our town had a wildfire that annihilated 2,500 homes
Oh,
inside of
no.
6 hours. It was so fast and so terrifying that immediately a friend of mine said, "You need to practice what you preach and put this into action. Get people together and support them." And so I did. And to this day, 2/3 of my clients are fire survivors locally. And what happened was I had the opportunity to teach people who were used to praying as a response only, or offering a casserole that had really beautiful, understandable, set responses to loss. I was able to take that and say, I see your compassion, I see your intention, but grace has to cost you something. And donating old clothes doesn't cost you very much. Going out of your way to be intentional and say, what do you actually need and how can I bring that to you? That costs you something. And whether it's the fire or not, the community members were people that I knew were so grateful to have someone who could say, let's do this differently without judging how we were doing it before. It's really easy to say platitudes are terrible and people who say platitudes are terrible. And the truth is, they're not terrible. They're uncomfortable and they're scared of saying the wrong thing. So the thought goes to, well, if I say something positive, that can't be harmful, right? And that's exactly how we get to toxic positivity, which is this don't worry, be happy, look for silver linings immediately. Like, I don't have a problem with silver linings, this little rabbit trail. But I think silver linings are meant for the person to find on their own, not to be told, here's a silver lining. That is a very personal decision to say, well, yeah, my mom died. And in the aftermath, I've become very much more present with my daughter as a mom that I don't know if I would have gotten there had she remained with us. That's consider it a silver lining to me, but if someone else said that to me, that would be their last opportunity to speak to me ever. Do you know?
I
So
totally understand.
so I think the community is hungry. I think all communities are hungry for this ability to become grief literate, but until you experience a reason for it, um, you wouldn't necessarily know that you need it. I've definitely worked with groups and communities who were like, "Why do we need to talk about grief?" And I'm like, "Listen, because you experience it on a daily basis and you're not experiencing it very efficiently or effectively on behalf of yourself. That's why you have like wounded people trying to recover all around you. So grief literacy would benefit you, but I'm not going to force feed you. If you want it, you'll come and find it, and if not, the people around you are hopefully doing that on on your behalf. But
Well, and so many of us learned through our culture,
sure.
okay? These are the things that you do, and I remember, um, growing up, my mother was a baker, and anybody in the community who passed away, my mother would stay up all night long and have the baked goods, and she always knew who liked what. And so when she'd bring in her tray, you know, there were smiles and, "Oh, thank you, Dorothy. You are wonderful." Um, but my mother was also a very blunt woman when she spoke. And uh, I didn't realize this until the last year or so, because my mother would intentionally come to somebody and say, "I know you may not know what you need, but
Mm,
if you come up with it, I'm here for you. But in the
mm,
meantime, I'm going to let you
mm,
have the time and space that you need."
yeah.
And, every once in a while she'd creep back in and she'd say the exact same thing. And sometimes it took days, weeks, months. And then somebody would say, "I'm so glad you're here, Dorothy. You really
Mm,
never left." And I learned that from my mom, that
yeah.
when you have 100 people standing around you saying, "I'm here for you," maybe one of you should step back
Yeah.
and be there tomorrow or next week and not get lost. But it is difficult because as people, um, we want things over and done with.
Right.
You know, uh, I was talking to somebody earlier today about the hurricane down in Florida, and she's so grateful that it's totally missing them. And she said, "Everybody keeps asking me how I am. I don't want to tell them how I am.
Mm,
They can look on a map." And my first reaction was, "But we care." But I said, "Have you told them you don't want them to ask anymore?" And she said, "Never thought of that."
yeah.
And so she posted it on Facebook within minutes.
Stop asking me.
um,
Yeah,
yeah.
I love that. I think
But
that the oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
no, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just gonna say with when it comes to grief supporters like your mom and the hordes of people, we've got this idea that this is our calling, we're supposed to comfort and come around. And one thing I say to grief supporters, but also to grievers, is that is actually something you can do ahead of time before you're grieving, is really define who your supporters are, because it might not be my place to insert myself in a person's story as a supporter because I'm effective as a supporter or because I want to. And I think that can be really overwhelming, especially in faith communities too, when you have 30 people who are asking how you're doing and they want to know what they can do for you, um, as opposed to you being able to say, actually, I've got 3 people in my corner. I am cared for. Thank you so much. Don't bother me again, in the most loving way. Like, it's okay for you to take a step back. You're released from your seemingly obligated perspective of supporting me through this. And um, because what you are doing in that is cultivating core people who can be authentic with you, who you can be authentic with as well, and that who will in that authenticity remain across time, theoretically remain throughout the duration of this acute grief process, and even when things turn subtle, who are still there and who recognize that just because it's subtle doesn't mean it's absent. that yes, if I go to the rodeo and my husband and I always went to the rodeo, then I'm going to be thinking of him when I'm there without him. And that is doesn't mean that I'm going to break down in the middle of it, but it does mean that that's on my mind, and being aware of that need of a person to have that acknowledged is a truly cultivated gift that some people really have, but it comes again from being authentic and intentional rather than just throwing your support behind everybody who's lost someone.
Absolutely. So, how can our listeners find you, follow you, um, reach out to you if they're looking for a coach? And also, how do they get your book?
Yeah, it's a great question. So everything is under my name, Mandy Capehart, or Restorative Grief. So I host a podcast called Restorative Grief with Mandy Capehart. That's available. It's weekly. My website, mandicapehart.com, has all the links to both of my shows as well as my book, which is available on Amazon or Barnes and Noble. And then I'm actually very active on Twitter at Mandy Capehart. I love interacting with people and hearing how the support resources I've created are helping them. But I really love getting questions because that's where so much of my content gets to come from. Then my experiences with clients one on one, I'll share if I have permission, but I tend to keep that stuff very, very close to the vest instead of talking about it. And so those interactions online really do fuel a lot of incredible conversations that really are, they're just designed to create literacy around grief. How do we get more comfortable talking about this? How do we say things without causing harm? How do we make it awkward so that it's not painful? Because awkward is just, it's just discomfort. It's just another uncomfortable emotion. And it doesn't matter if it's uncomfortable. Everybody is uncomfortable when there's grief involved. That's just normal. It's okay to be uncomfortable.
It's interesting because we all think that somebody else is much better off than us. You know, um, they don't, they don't worry about how they look because they always look great.
Sure.
And the reality of it is, we all have those insecurities,
Yeah.
um, and it's okay. And sometimes those insecurities get very deep and wide when
Yeah.
we're going through something that we're grieving over. And again, it can be everything from the loss of a loved one to even the loss of an object. Um, I found a year after my mother passed away that a ring that I had, it wasn't my mother's, but a ring that my parents helped me purchase, is gone.
Mm.
Can't find it. And it felt like I was losing my mom again.
Right.
But I had to find a way to identify that the ring was not her, but
Right.
it was still a precious thing to me.
Yeah.
And so I want people to understand that, yeah, it can be just about anything that hits you, and it can disrupt you for a moment or longer.
Yeah. I
Well,
I
I am so excited that we finally met, Mandy,
I know.
because as I told you, we have a new podcast that meets once a month. It's called Grief Belief. We have a panel of four, and we're going to be expanding. And I think so many of the things that we talked about today are going to be so perfect for that show. So I'm hoping to rein you in. Um, and to all of our listeners, it's okay to grieve. Don't let somebody tell you, it's about time you stop, because you got to do what you got to do.
Yeah, it takes as long as it takes. It's necessary, in fact.
Absolutely. Have a wonderful day, and we will be in touch soon. Okay.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Bye bye now.